love to just make sure that we understand your definition of racism, because I think it's really important for the solutions that I hope we get to. And I should let you define it. but the idea of more favorable evaluation or treatment, I think that's a really powerful idea, because that becomes an outcome we can do something about.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Rita. So I start off with a relatively simple definition just to get people grounded, because my first chapter is, a lot of people don't believe that racism exists. And part of the answer to why they don't believe racism exists is because they have a very distorted notion of what racism is. And so a lot of white people may think that racism is extreme acts, such as, the tragedy that happened in Charleston West or South Carolina, where the white supremacists murdered 11 innocent people in the church, or even classic examples like Jackie Robinson, where you have this person who's excluded just because of their race, but they don't really have a good understanding of what unconscious bias or more subtle forms of racism are. And so I define racism as, I have this phrase, racism resides in the Delta. And this is the idea that, racism is really about the difference in how people are treated. So if you have a police officer that gives a Black person a ticket for jaywalking, and you want to know, is that racism? Maybe, maybe not. The real question is, would a white person get a ticket for jaywalking in the same scenario? And if they would not, then it is an example of racism, even though the person is acting in a consistent way with respect to the law. But that's not the issue. The issue is, are people seen differently? Are they perceived differently? Are they evaluated differently? Are they treated differently in the same situation? So even if you have someone who's, acting in a way that is considered to be inappropriate, if a white person is allowed to act in that way that's inappropriate, then it's still racism if you come down on the person of color. And so I think that gives a different spin to it for a lot of people, that it's not just this objective thing, but it's really this comparative situation. And because we don't have a time machine, it's often difficult to, press pause, rewind, and then, switch out the man for the woman, or switch out the Black person for the white person, press play, and then, show the person two videos. Here's how you responded in scenario X with the white person. Here's how you responded in scenario X with the Black person, and show them the difference. So people walk through the world thinking that they treat everyone the same because they never get that contrast condition to see how they would have responded if the person had been a different race. But that's what we do in randomized controlled trials, is the situation is exactly the same except for the race. The resume qualifications are exactly the same. The education level is exactly the same. The only thing that varies is the name Lakeisha versus Emily, or Jamal versus Gregory. And we see that these applicants are treated very, very differently. So that's what racism is. And it's very prevalent if you define it in that way. Mm-hmm. An officer once told me, I asked him, how many officers on your force do you think, based on your definition, are racially biased? And he said about 10%. And then I said, well, imagine you've got some teenagers who are out horsing around. In one scenario, the teenagers are Black. In the other scenario, the teenagers are white. How many of your officers do you think would treat those scenarios differently? And he said about 90%. And I said, well, that's racism, right? The fact that so it was really interesting. He said, I never thought about it that way. I said, yes, if you have people who are systematically treating suspects differently based on their race, or have more patience with white teenagers than Black teenagers, then by my definition, that's what racism is. It doesn't have to involve hatred. It doesn't have to involve intent. It doesn't have to involve, membership in the Ku Klux Klan, or however it is you're defining it. It's just the practice of evaluating or treating people differently on the basis of race. And that's my simple definition. Then I start to talk about institutional power and laws and things, and how we get this asymmetry in racism because of the system and because of the history of this country, and so forth and so on.